In animation, a dozen concentric bands in various colors and textures swirl behind the words Ability Summit. Rylan
Welcome,
Rogers.
everybody. I'm thrilled that you decided to join us for this conversation. I happen to think it's the best conversation of the Disability Summit, a chance to really dive into public policy at this moment when there's significant shifts in the international environment. I'm really thrilled to have an amazing panel here today that can really help us dig into how public policy can help every person and organization on our goals to be more accessible and to reach every person on the planet. So I wanted to save all of the time for the rich conversation I know is coming our way and start with allowing our panelists to introduce themselves. I'm going to ask them to tell us who they are, what their current role is, and to share how they're feeling, how the outcomes of recent global elections are impacting disability policy from where they sit in the world. So I'm going to ask Maria to start us off with this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Rylan. I'm so thrilled to be here today. My name is Maria Town, and I serve as the president and CEO of the American Association of People with Disabilities, a national cross-disability civil rights organization that works to increase the political and economic power of disabled people in the United States. And importantly, I myself am a disabled person. I have cerebral palsy, and I live in Washington, D.C., so I'm feeling a lot in this moment. And one of the things that I'm feeling is the just real importance of community in order to make sure that we can continue making progress and advance inclusion, even when our policymakers seem to be going in a different direction.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it over the sea and over to Daniel.
Hello, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for inviting EDF also to this interesting panel. So my name is Daniel Casas, and I'm Accessibility Policy Officer at the European Disability Forum, which is the umbrella organization that represents the disability movement at the European level. Also, regarding the question of how we see recent elections, recent changes internationally, I think since Maria talked about the US, I can talk a bit about Europe. And as most of you know, we had elections in the parliament last June, and we had a new commission being elected. And we as EDF, that's one of the big frameworks in which we work. So basically what we can say is that we are in a transition moment. So there's new representatives in the parliament, there's new commissioners. We know that the last terms, there were really important actions in disability, such European Accessibility Act that we will cover, and the disability card. So basically, we are in a moment where we have to basically see what will happen in the new years. Will we have really ambitious initiatives that really keep on pushing for the rights of persons with disabilities? Of course, we as EDF, we have a list of things that we want to achieve, but that's one of the things that's I would say in our agenda, and I hope that maybe in 1 year time we can really give more clarity. But just as a final reflection, I would say also what's going to be interesting to see is, I would say in this context that we have now, defense, security, innovation, competitiveness, it's really high on the agenda. And we really need to make sure that the rights of persons with disabilities, inclusion, social affairs are also high in the agenda. And I think this is going to be one of the big fights in the coming years.
Really helpful. Ima, please join our conversation.
Yes, hello. My name is Ima Placencia. I work at the European Commission. I'm senior expert in the unit that is responsible for disability policies. We have a strategy to implement those policies, and also the unit acts as focal point for the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm leading on the disability team, and in particular, most of my work relates to accessibility, including the implementation and the work related to the European Accessibility Accessibility Act, but also part of my work is really mainstreaming disability and accessibility in other EU policies and legislation. In relation where we see us today, well, we are in a kind of transition because Daniel referred to the new parliament. We have a new commission, and from our side, our commissioner got in her mission letter, is Commissioner Labib, the mandate, to put it that way, to continue implementing the strategy and the disability strategy and the CRPD. And well, she's restated in the parliament. We have now reached the mid-term of the disability strategy. It was 2130. We're halfway, and she committed to continue the implementation of the strategy. So we feel pretty safe and full of energy and interest to continue working on disability policies.
I love that sort of quick global snapshot and a couple of really important key themes, the role of community at this time and the global community. And then also each of you sort of spoke to what's happening and the work left to be done. I was particularly energized, Daniel, by your comment of like the to-do list. I need a to-do list, so that's great to hear. When I think about that to-do list in my life, it's a lot of change has happened recently in terms of laws and regulations and movements forward. Things in the U.S. Rulemaking that happened, they were finalized in the last administration. You mentioned some EU laws. So I would love to sort of hear your thoughts about the key regulations that are coming, and particularly we're a tech company. Lots of folks that have joined the Ability Summit are thinking about websites and applications in the digital space, but really thinking about what are the implications of regulations that have happened or are coming into force. Daniel, I'll ask you to start us off.
Okay. So basically, the first thing that I want to say, and this is the approach that we as EDF have in terms of accessibility, is that we really believe that legislation is needed to really achieve it. So if there's been soft approaches in the past, they really do not make the change required. So we really celebrate that at the European level and also in the US, there's been different legislations developed over time. The Web Accessibility Directive, the European Accessibility Act, or the ADA. We think that that's the way to really make a change for society. So when it comes to the European Accessibility Act, Inma can really give you all the details. What we want to say is that we really supported it, and that we really celebrate that for the first time, there's a EU-wide legislation that really sets minimum requirements for products and services, and it affects both the public and the private sector. I mean, this is really great news because in those countries in Europe where there was no accessibility legislation, now we will have something. And we are using the powers of the internal market to achieve this. And as you know, Europe is a big market. So these are the right tools to promote this. In terms of what specific changes will it bring, I mean, I'm going to name a few. Like, for example, I mean, I work a lot on air transport. This is one of the files. And I know that especially the visually impaired community complain that the websites and the apps are not accessible. So one of the things that the European Accessibility Act will change is that from this year on, these websites will have to be accessible. There's also the issue with emergency communications, that the means that we have right now are not accessible. So the European Accessibility Act will really require accessible means of access to the 112, which is the European emergency number. So we really see important changes, especially in the digital domain. And one thing that I want to say as well is that there will be also structural changes because legislation cannot change everything. Some things that we've seen in the past is, for example, the shortage of accessibility professionals. And we really believe that by requiring companies and public administration to really make products and services accessible and to have the knowledge also as public administration to check what's accessible or not, basically there will be demand in the job market for these specialists, which is really positive. And also there will be greater awareness among society on accessibility. And the last thing that I want to say is that, the scope of the act is limited. So it covers, I would say, quite a lot of products and services, but there are still challenges with, for example, the built environment or home appliances. And that's where basically we still have work to be done. We are in the good track. The Accessibility Act is a good basis, but we'll need to continue working to really make sure accessibility is really present throughout society.
Thanks. That's a great overview. I sit in an office that has a countdown timer to when the act will be in full force. So I'll turn it over to Ima to hear a little bit more.
Well, for me, it's really an exciting time because I've been dedicating quite a large part of my life to prepare the Accessibility Act and work on its implementation. And now the countdown is there. I mean, in June this year, the act will be applicable. And I really think it is really good news for persons with disabilities, because there will be more products and services in the European market, but also I think also for economic operators, because on one hand, I mean, the Act facilitates the work. It takes away the fragmentation that would be in the European market, having only national legislation. At the same time, I'm a firm believer on accessibility, and I think that the implications of accessibility on products and services in terms of flexibility, in terms of personalization, really make the products more usable for everybody. So I really think we all need to be proud to have more and better products in the market. So we are now really investing a lot on getting the national rules that follow the directive right. Discussing with member states. We have infringements open in all member states at this moment for different things. I mean, for some of them are really details, for some others is really more work needs to be done. But what I would like to, and I hope this will bring really, I'm convinced it will bring a big change. But I would like to mention also two things, because on what's happening also. What I see that now is happening more and more is that in EU legislation, we are having references to accessibility in many different rules. We have references to accessibility in the electronic communication codes, in the audiovisual media service, in public procurement, in EU funds, in the artificial intelligence regulation, on equality bodies, which are bodies that need to address discrimination in the Union, in alternative fuel infrastructure legislation that refers also to accessibility, in the European Disability Card. And what we are doing is to make sure that all those requirements point, or try to make that all those requirements point to the European Accessibility Act and the requirements to keep harmonization, to keep coherence. Now, as all the processes, you have to realize that the making legislation in Europe is also a matter of negotiations and consensus. So in those processes, the wording, the references are a bit slightly different. But I think that we are moving into having a better understanding, a common better understanding that where accessibility needs to be placed and how to place it. I agree with Danielle that the issue of skills shortage, knowledge, experienced persons to implement this legislation is a challenge, and that is why we have put forward Accessible EU, which is a resource center that is providing trainings, is gathering information, collecting resources, and creating really a community of practice on accessibility. We have set this work through a contractor and a consortium. It's been secure. It is now secure for 4 years. It's a contract, but we see the importance of having that power and competence in order to implement the legislation. Without that, it would be really a problem. So a lot is happening in terms of regulation, and in terms of accessibility. Really, this consistency, I think, is really essential to have effective and coherent implementation.
Really helpful. I'm going to turn it to Maria. I heard so many connections to the work that I know that you're doing in the U.S. around websites, rulemaking, travel, etc. So fill us in.
I can't stress enough like how important that consistency is, and that is, in my opinion, why regulation and law are essential in creating accessibility standards. And last year in April, the U.S. Department of Justice finalized, I want to emphasize, a very, very long-awaited rule for compliance of state and local government websites to be accessible. So this is within Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this rule requires that state and local government websites and web applications comply with Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 AA. And there is a graduated timeline for compliance based on the size of a particular place or locality. So in theory, according to what the rule says, we should start seeing state and local governments begin to comply as early as April 2026, if not before, with smaller areas needing to comply by April of 2027. I'm going to take like a point of personal privilege. I worked on this rule when I worked in the Obama administration. This rule took 14 years to finalize, which is, it honestly created a problem. The length of time that it took for the government to finalize this regulation, because, preaching to the choir here, technology changes really fast. And so the longer that the U.S. waited to establish a kind of foundation of accessibility compliance for websites and web apps, the harder it was going to become, right? And so the community was thrilled that this finally happened, and further thrilled because initially the Department of Justice proposed a number of exceptions to compliance with this rule. And the reason why I want to mention this is because I think it actually highlights the importance of community advocacy and ensuring that governments and companies themselves are in dialogue with impacted communities. There were a number of exceptions in the proposed rule, and because of the disability community's work to say, we are everywhere. We're using websites at every level of government, from school boards to city councils to departments of emergency management. The Department of Justice basically walked back those exceptions and created extremely narrow exceptions for compliance. And so the final rule was actually much stronger than the proposed rule, and we're really looking forward to its widespread implementation. Just being very candid and honest, I think there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen with this rule, and if the current Department of Justice is going to continue to facilitate its enforcement through the publication of technical assistance resources. But I'm still very glad that it exists, because it gives state and local governments themselves a guideline for what they can expect and what they should be complying to, even if they're no longer required to by the federal government. It also gives people with disabilities a tool to say, this is what our websites and our web applications should look like and should operate like. And so companies like Microsoft then also have a guide themselves to know, here's what we can anticipate. Here's the kind of standard we can anticipate being held to in the future in case new leadership comes into place in a subsequent administration. And on the kind of talent issue, which I think is real, one of the arguments that the disability community used and continues to use to push for web accessibility regulations, is the fact that if you're in a kind of digital first mode, whether you are a municipality or a health clinic or a vendor, you're doing website updates all the time. And so just like if you're putting on an event, you need to proactively budget for accessibility. If you're redesigning your website or your web application, a part of your expected cost should be WCAG compliance or 508 compliance or accessibility generally. So this isn't a separate kind of set of skills or a kind of bonus feature. These skills should be standards within the field of coding and web development.
I love so much in that. And I love in particular the sort of call to action from all three of you, or the information sharing from all three of you to our audience about sort of what's happening and where there are now rules and regulations that businesses and developers and the community can look at to see what is the expectation and how we can move things forward in that space. This conversation is always so rich, and so I have anxiety that we're going to run out of time. So I wanted to talk a little bit about everyone's thoughts of the power and challenge in this AI transition that we're in the midst of, but also want to allow some time to talk about how we collectively can unblock disabled talent in employment. Both topics are really front and center at Microsoft, as our company has benefited from the talents of so many disabled innovators and employees that really make our product and our work better. And so thinking about that in a business perspective is critical moving forward. And we're actively engaged in the world of AI and learning about what it's accelerating in terms of accessibility and what we need to be including to make sure it works for everyone. So I'm going to give you a chance to sort of pick what you want to focus on in our next answer, or whether it's a little bit of both. This time we'll start with Maria to sort of take our conversation forward.
Where do I start, Rylan? So I'll touch on AI a little bit, and artificial intelligence tools, they're out there, right? They're not going back in the box. And so from an AAPD perspective, we're really approaching this from how can we ensure that we're not just mitigating bias in AI tools, but that AI tools can actually create greater opportunity for inclusion and for disabled people to thrive. And so let's think about how artificial intelligence is already being used to enhance the quality of life of people with disabilities, especially in their jobs. You have executive function type tools, automated reminders, right? These same tools can be used to help remind folks to take their medication or to get up and stretch if you're someone like me who is very, very stiff. We've also got, automated transcription tools that can be used for individuals who have a hard time hearing or who have language processing disabilities, right? And these tools are often tools that people can acquire without going through a really formal, so often burdensome, formal accommodations process, right? And that is one of the places where I think AI can become extremely beneficial as these tools are expanded in workplaces where we do get to a point of more universal design, where instead of having to have this specific disclosure of disability and potentially fraught conversation with a manager where people feel anxious and nervous, a company like Microsoft can say these are tools available to all employees, and then myself or another person could say, oh, I want to start using this tool within Teams or this tool within Office 365. Now, that's not to say that self-disclosure isn't really important, and I think AI can also help with that. How many of us are using AI tools to figure out how to have tough conversations, right? Can you put a prompt into Microsoft's AI tools that says, tell me how I can disclose my disability and request a reasonable accommodation where I don't have to be afraid of losing my job? And I've actually done that exercise, and what I get back is really good. So these are some of the instances that give me a lot of hope. But I also am not going to sit here and say I'm not also concerned. And so I do think that digging into disability bias in AI and looking at the issue of disability data, which is a persistent one, is an enormous task. And what I mean by that is disabled people, we haven't been counted for a variety of reasons. And also within disability data, there is significant diversity. Even people with my same disability, cerebral palsy, can have extremely different access needs and preferences. And so a data set may not accurately capture our experiences navigating automated decision-making tools. And so efforts to increase the presence, quality, and accuracy of disability data to inform AI training, like large language model training, I think are exceptionally important.
Really helpful. Daniel, I'm going to ask you to jump into this conversation.
Yeah, I think Maria covered really well the answer. So the first thing that I think it's important to keep in mind is how persons with disabilities are really uptakers of technology, and how it really has proved it has removed most of the barriers that we encounter in our daily life. And AI gives a lot of examples, like even text to speech technologies, automatic captioning, are really progressing really quick and are really making a difference. So at EDF, I'm not the leading person on AI, but what we can say is that we're also focusing a lot in it, because it's not only any technology, it's a really game changer. And our approach when we're dealing with AI is basically to ensure that AI is accessible for persons with disabilities, because there can be new barriers being created. But also, and that was also one of the topics that Maria mentioned, is the issue of also data sets, discrimination, etc. So we are also careful, especially with certain areas like access to employment, education, or public allowances, where we basically say, here we really need to make sure that the right tools are in place to really ensure that even if it's unintendedly, that the technology does not discriminate. And in Europe, Imma mentioned the AI Act, which was basically an effort at the European level to regulate the use of technology. And so we see good things there. We see that there's some accessibility provision, although not all AI systems are covered. But is a basis to basically start working with it. But there's also just one last thing that I like to mention, because there's many specific AI applications that have been developed for persons with disabilities that are really great. But the problem sometimes is with mainstream AI, which, as I said, it's not always accessible. I can mention an example. Something that happened to me is my credit card was blocked, and I wanted to get it unblocked. And the bank branch said, okay, I went physically, and they said, no, you need to just call this number. And when I called, there was not a person, there was a machine telling me, please explain your problem, and I will tell you what to do. And it was in French, and I have a small accent, and the system could not recognize my voice. So I really struggled for a few weeks until I got my credit card unblocked. So just to mention one example on if AI is not well designed, there can be barriers for other type of, for persons with disabilities or persons with other functional limitations. And the last thing as well is that AI is really a good tool. It needs to be used. It can really change things, but it needs to go together with other things, because sometimes the reasoning is AI will solve everything. And I work in accessibility, and sometimes the challenge is not the lack of technology. So we need sometimes resources, political commitment, awareness, which is really important. So we really need to make sure that both work goes hand in hand to really get the job done.
Yeah, I love that call out. At Microsoft, we frame AI as a co-pilot, which is obviously a critical brand issue, but it speaks to that it has to be a human connection as well. And I think that's a really important call out. Ima, Daniel shared a little bit about the European AI Act, and I know that your work on the EAA also drives employment forward, so I'm going to bring you into the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, let me start by saying that the regulation on artificial intelligence, what it aims to do is really to cater for the safeguard of the fundamental rights of everybody, including persons with disabilities, and having trustworthy AI. And it takes a risk-based approach. So the level of intervention in the different, let's say, AI developments depends on the risk that AI might pose. So there are some AI that is considered not acceptable because it puts an acceptable risk. Then you have high risk, and then there are some measures to take care that those risks are mitigated. Then you go to limited risk or even minimal risk, where there are really no rules. There is no intervention by the EU. What is true is that in this this risk, there are risks of artificial intelligence. Some have been mentioned, the issue of data, but I think also it's important to reflect on the role that algorithms can take in terms of bias, fairness, automatic decision making, accountability, privacy, and so forth. And of course, the issue of accessibility is really also important and is mentioned in the regulation, because otherwise persons with disabilities would not be able to use it. In terms of opportunities, of course, there are many possibilities to support persons with disabilities in communication by navigating interfaces, access to information, applications in all the areas. Education, employment is a good one. But indeed, yes, data algorithms and the user interface need to be properly addressed. What I find important also is that on the accessibility of artificial intelligence, a link has been established with the European Accessibility Act, so that we maintain that consistency and coherence across applications and sectors, to be sure that it becomes really a reality. I think that the Act contains many references to accessibility and to disability, and let me refer also to the fact that the Commission issued just very recently, a couple of months ago, guidance on prohibited artificial intelligence practices that are established by the regulation. So it goes into more detail to provide more guidance, and I think it's a very useful document to read, because it goes into what is forbidden, what is harmful exploitation of the vulnerabilities of persons, including persons with disabilities, and talks about the manipulation, deception, exploitation. It addresses how it affects individuals and how certain practices are really forbidden in the EU. So I think that this is, of course, a very new field, and we need to adapt the rules, the laws, as it develops. And also, just to tell you, we had a recent conversation with those making standards for the on artificial intelligence and addressing the issue of disability and accessibility in the standards, related standards. And we established also contact with experts outside Europe, because again, once more, this consistency on AI and disability is important to be maintained. I don't know if you would like that we say something on in relation to employment now, or I give you back the floor.
I think I'll have to cut you off, which is painful for me, because I love that, and I love that the update that there's been the recent connection on standards around accessibility and disability with the folks working on the AI Act. So great sort of breaking news. So thanks for that. We've got about 20,000 people listening in today. So there, no pressure, but there's a bit of an audience out there. So as we sort of close out, I wanted to give you each an opportunity to share with us sort of a call to action. What you would tell the audience, our folks from industry, the employers, the disability community. What can we all do to support public policy modernization? What do you want people to do? Daniel, I'll ask you to start us off.
Okay, now it's the moment of my to-do list. No, I'm joking.
Excellent, I want it.
No, I mean, the first thing, and I think that's why this event that Microsoft is organizing is so good, is basically to raise awareness and to understand how positive accessibility is, how it basically benefits everyone, and how it drives innovation. And we've done a lot of progress over the years altogether, but there's still work to be done to really, would say, preach and get the world out there. And the last thing, I mean, the second thing that I can say is that, I mean, we work a lot on legislation, but at the end of the day, it's all a matter of joint effort. We need all stakeholders, public administrations, companies, organizations of persons with disabilities, civil society, to really work together. And for example, for companies, I think that's something that I would really recommend, is to really embrace diversity, to have people within the workforce. Also, when developing any product, any service, to really keep accessibility in mind, even if there's no legislation there. I think that's something that it's really good for everyone, and that it will really bring benefits. And one thing that we always say is to really engage with the disability community as well. At any moment, to really have direct contact, to exchange ideas, to really get this, I would say, joint co-creation process for everything that we do, that always brings great results.
Awesome. Ima, what's your 2 minutes or less call to action for us?
Well, the first thing is really to embrace accessibility as a matter of quality, and see the positive impact that accessibility will have in the products and the services for the whole population. I would dare even to invite to look beyond the legislation to other products and services are not in the scope of the legislation. But in relation to those that are in the scope, I really invite economic operators to look at the accessibility requirements and be ready, be implemented, because you will have in the markets a growing number of consumers that are expecting to have a certain accessibility in place. Also for governments, I mean, we're trying to have and discussing with them the correctness, the completeness of their legislation, which is really very important. And I think the what I mentioned before about increasing capacity on accessibility is an important wish. And finally, to invite all of you to participate in the standards. I mean, really, we have legislation that goes across many sectors, and without the sectors representative themselves, it will be difficult.
Awesome. Maria, you've got the final call to action.
Well, I just want to say ditto to everything Daniel and Ima said. And I also want to name accessibility is not a destination, it is a discipline. It is something that we all must commit to every day. And if we are all effective in that commitment, we are going to learn new ways and new accessibility needs all the time, because the realm of what is possible continues to expand. And modernization of standards can actually, I think, catalyze the expansion of what's possible, because it allows companies and other institutional actors to, again, all have the same baseline. But our shared goal is not actually a shared destination. It's a shared discipline and a shared understanding that continues to create greater quality of life, economic security, and prosperity for everyone. And that is desperately needed today.
I couldn't love all of that anymore. So I guess I need to say ditto, 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 ditto. And really thank you for this conversation and for the opportunity for us all to dig in and think about where we are related to regulatory requirements, legal changes that are happening globally, and back to Maria's point, the community and the commitment to be on this journey continuously together. So thank you all for your time, and thanks to our audience for joining us for, as we think, the best breakout session of Ability Summit.
Resources include aapd.com, edf-feph.org. In animation, colorful, undulating bands frame the words, "Thank you for participating, and there's more to explore." Discover other resources in the top navigation bar.